It's another Friday evening, and although I got home late, my wife Victoria came even later. I didn't like that she went out with her friends after work. But what can a man do? Every couple really needs a life apart from their spouse, and Vicky was very kind, not only letting me know when she was leaving, but letting me know where they were going, and making sure she got home early. She usually arrived no later than 8 in the evening. This afternoon I was at a work review and received a text message from Vicky. "The four of us have a drink. I'll come home late, my love." Vicky usually treats her appearances well. In fact, this usually happens no more than once every 3 to 4 weeks. So why does it bother me so much? Well, that's another story. In short, let's just say that I have trust issues with women in general. No, that's not true either. I have trouble trusting people, male or female, who spend time at a bar with their friends and without a spouse, or who frequently travel for business. Vicky does both, but the travel is by far the hardest for me. You may be asking why I have these problems and how they affect my perception of Vicky. I'll tell you a short, sad story so you can see for yourself. I grew up in a bar, literally. My parents owned and operated the most popular bar in our small town outside of St. Louis, Missouri. They also operated an upscale French restaurant in the other half of the bar building. People came from all over the area to eat, and then went next door to the bar and danced the night away. I saw all this, and at an early age my parents drilled prudence into my head. It was the summer when I turned 16, and they decided that I needed to learn business. My older brother and sister both started working in this business when they were also 16 years old. By the time I started working there, my brother was 21, had a degree in hotel and restaurant management, and was running a bar. My sister was almost 19 and just starting college. Of course, at my young age, I was not allowed to work in a bar. I started waiting tables in a restaurant. I deeply resented this requirement because, like most teenagers, I wanted to run around the streets and do things with my friends. I wanted to work as little as possible for a lot of money in what I chose, preferably in a place where I could flirt with a lot of young, beautiful girls. I had only been working at the restaurant for 3 weeks when I started to change the way I thought about things. Oh my God, I saw so many tits that I thought I was going blind. I also got to see a lot of the infamous little black dresses. Several times my father or mother had to come to the door separating the bar and restaurant to send me back to my job at the restaurant. My sister was working that night. She came up to me and said, "Donnie, you better get back to your work and ignore everything you see, otherwise you'll get in trouble." I turned to her and said, "But little sister, this is Mrs. Horton, and she's out with a man. She doesn't even have underwear on. Do you think Mr. Horton knows? God, I can't wait to tell the guys, it's amazing." Sarah looked scared and looked over her shoulder, then muttered under her breath, "Oh, shit." About this time, I felt my father's large hand on my shoulder. He squeezed her tightly and said, "Don, come with me right now." He turned and walked through the dining room, past the waiter's counter and into his office. I followed him slowly and, to tell the truth, with fear. That evening I was sent back to work enough to realize that I was going to have a serious conversation with my father. When I entered the office, he looked at me and said, "Close the door and sit down." I thought, oh damn, this is going to be really bad. I almost turned inside out while I sat and watched my father look at me. Finally, he sighed and spoke. "Don, I should have talked to you about this before I let you start working here, but I just didn't. I had to have the same conversation with your brother and sister, and believe me, repetition doesn't make it any easier." "Mrs. Horton is a beautiful woman, isn't she, son?" asked my father. I was so shocked that I jumped a little and felt a little dizzy. I wondered where my father was going with this question and why he changed the subject. While I was trying to formulate my answer, he asked again, "Isn't it?" I swallowed and nodded my head. "Yes," while whispering, "Uh-huh." Dad leaned his elbows on the table, intertwined his fingers, and rested his chin on his thumbs. I still remember his sigh and sad look. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and spoke again. I can still hear his words even 20 years later. He said, "Son, this business is our life and livelihood. It supports the whole family. This provides us with our beautiful home and pool. It sent your brother to college, and it will send your sister and you to college too. This will take care of us all for years to come unless we do something to screw it up. Dawn. If someone you know comes here with their family, you smile and greet them by name. You can visit him while doing your work if the client wants. But you must remember one very important thing. When you're in a business like this, you have selective hearing and vision. Part of working in the food service and bar industry is discretion. You don't see anything you shouldn't see. If someone you know comes here with someone of the opposite sex who is not part of their family, you call them sir or ma'am, unless they tell you otherwise. You don't remember they were here on that occasion. You especially don't remember anything they did or how they were dressed. If our customers do something off-color, we ignore it as long as we can and don't talk about it outside of the establishment. All staff adhere to the same strict rules. If I ever hear anyone on staff gossiping about a customer, I fire him or her. I've had to fire some really great employees over the years because they couldn't keep their mouths shut about clients. We are known for our discretion and the quality of our food and service. Son, you are young and I know how your hormones are raging. Heck, even at my age, I look at women like Mrs. Horton if I have the chance. Your mom knows that I do it and that you will do it. But she also knows that it's like window shopping. You look and never buy or try on the product. I don't expect you not to look, but I do expect you to be discreet and not make it as obvious as you did tonight. Something else you should know, son, is that people like Mrs. Horton always get exposed. The gossip will start somewhere else and eventually reach her husband. If he was like most men, it would end their marriage. People who cheat on their spouse always become careless, and eventually the spouse finds out about it. We don't want to be the start of something like this. Many of them have young children, and divorce hurts the children very much. Now get back to work and remember what I said. I went back to my job that day and worked in a restaurant off and on throughout high school and college. I never gossiped about clients, but I saw too much deception for a person my age. After I got older and started working in a bar, I would watch groups of men or women come to a boys' or girls' party. I watched as those I knew who were married did things that I knew would not pass the test of marital fidelity. I learned. Perhaps I learned too much because I also learned to be intolerant of people who went to a guy's or girl's party and stayed late. I learned that many people who were in the area on business were having fun and trying to pick up locals. Of course, it's fine if they are not married, but many of them were married, or at least wore rings indicating it. In many cases, they hooked up with one of our married clients. I learned to disrespect and disgust them, but treated them all with the same amount of politeness and discretion. At the end of the day, we really wanted to have a successful business. I noticed that those who came to parties and left early after a drink or two had good, stable marriages. Those who stayed late had difficult marriages and many got divorced. During my freshman year of college, my father hired a new waitress. When I first saw Victoria, I was filled with lust. Working together over the next 2 years, we fell in love. We met, got to know families and other relatives. We talked and discovered that we were kindred spirits. We watched all the traitors who came into the bar and laughed at their antics and stupidity. Finally, the Christmas before we were supposed to graduate from college, I asked Vicky to marry me. By then, we both knew that we had the same ideas about life and would be a couple for life. The only hiccup in our relationship was our parents' request for a prenuptial agreement. Vicky and I knew we were life partners and thought it was stupid. My parents had a business and, to my surprise, a large investment holding. They wanted it to be protected if I inherited it. To my surprise, I discovered that Vicky's parents wanted the same thing. They had a very large fortune and did not want Vicky's potential share to be shared with me if we divorced. The way the agreement was drafted solved these problems. We agreed that everything we owned before marriage or inherited from our maternal relatives would remain with us in the event of divorce. The agreement also covered pensions. Each of us will keep ours. The only thing we divided was the property acquired jointly after marriage. The agreement even covered childcare in the event we divorced with minor children. If one of us traveled more than the other, the children were to be placed in the custody of the parent who traveled less, unless this posed a danger to the children. The day of graduation finally arrived. Vicky earned her bachelor's degree in finance and landed a great job at a local headquartered brokerage firm. I received a bachelor's degree in construction management and a minor in landscape architecture. After college, I worked for a construction company for 2 years, learning the trade. Neither Vicky nor I were interested in a restaurant or bar. My parents turned it into a corporation, and we let my sister and brother run the business. Mom remained an accountant, and Dad was just Dad. He was the boss, even if it didn't show on paper. After 2 years of working for another company, I opened my own construction and landscaping business. Since Vicky and I could barely pay for our house and cars, my parents essentially provided the capital for the family corporation's business. I received a salary to manage it. It wasn't easy for us at first, but Vicky steadily moved up the ranks. Finally, one day, she returned home very happy. She was selected for a position in the brokerage company's compliance department. This is the division that ensures that satellite offices comply with all rules and regulations of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The only downside was that her new job required some travel. Not excessively, only 3 or 4 days a month, but I'm worried about my past. Over time, my business grew. I went from small remodeling jobs to adding rooms and garages to building entire new buildings and landscaping them. I was happy with this arrangement, so I never tried to transfer the business out of the corporation and into my name. I just kept getting bigger and bigger salaries. To my pride, the value of the business and our gross income grew every year. I gradually came to terms with Vicky's travels, but never felt completely comfortable with them, although I was not happy with her nightly walks with the girls. She went out sometimes, but not more than once a month, and was usually home by 8 p.m. Of course, I also had to travel from time to time, and I would sometimes go out for a beer after working with construction crews or office staff. It's just good management. However, I made sure to leave after a couple of beers. I usually returned home no more than an hour later than usual, even if I was meeting with my employees. Unless, of course, Vicky came with me. After we had been married for 3 years, Vicky and I decided to have children. Our first child was Patrick, and then 18 months later, my little Suzanne arrived. She was so tiny, and as she grew, she controlled me. By the time she was 4 years old, she looked exactly like her mother, a younger version. When she gets older, your heart will probably stop. As Vicky's experience in her work grew, she became known as the go-to person to handle difficult situations in offices. She found problems and knew how to help them fix them. If she met resistance, she was not afraid to expose the criminal. If it didn't work, she wouldn't be afraid to call headquarters and use more force. Many of them were office managers who crossed her path and went looking for new jobs. Because of this, Vicky began to travel more. Now she was absent sometimes for 2 weeks a month. I hated it, and so did she. We talked. She thought she was on track to take over the department in just under 2 years. Then she would no longer travel and would receive a very significant increase in salary. We agreed to continue in the same spirit, waiting for such an opportunity. Because of the economic slowdown, my small company had to start looking for jobs that we would have given up before the housing market and stock market crashed. We have already laid off about half of our employees. We weren't in financial trouble because we didn't have major loans or overhead, but we weren't as profitable as we used to be. One of the small jobs I went to apply for led my marriage down a path of destruction. Oh, how I wish I had never taken this job. Perhaps then I could remain happily married. Perhaps not. I walked into my office Thursday morning wondering why I even bothered to come in. The night before, I stayed late and finished all the papers that were on my desk. Vicky has been away all week for compliance testing. From talking to her, I realized that she wouldn't be home until late Friday evening, so I worked. This morning, I almost went straight to one of our 3 work sites to spend the day getting my hands dirty and inspecting the work. As many of you know, the best way to keep employees on their toes and ensure quality is for the boss to be on the job with them and able to do their best. I hadn't been at my desk long when my assistant called me. She said, "Don, we have a casual environment here. I try to treat my employees like family. Mrs. Sloan is here and wants to talk about building a deck and landscaping her backyard. Do you have time to visit her?" I remember thinking, nice little veranda and some bushes, but I decided to talk anyway. After all, a couple of days' work might be suitable and would help some men work to feed their families. When Mrs. Sloane walked into my office, I was shocked. I was almost speechless. She looked so much like Mrs. Horton, the first lady I was obsessed with, that I could barely speak. I finally pulled myself together and stood up to greet her. I smiled and said, "Mrs. Sloane, I'm glad to meet you. I'm Don Patterson." Mrs. Simpson said, "You want to build a porch? This is right?" "Oh, excuse me," I said. "Please take a seat while we discuss your needs. I'm not usually like this, but you remind me so much of a lady I knew when I was younger. It was as if she had just walked into the room. Please forgive me." Mrs. Sloane laughed and then said, "Don, it's me, Jasmine." I guess she saw the uncertainty and confusion on my face because she continued, "You know, Jasmine Horton. Donita and Alfred Horton were my parents. We used to go to your family's restaurant all the time." "Oh my God," I said. "I'm sorry. You were much younger and have changed so much." Jasmine laughed that sexy, tinkling laugh and then said, "Well, I guess we've all changed a little. I was only 10 years old when Mom and Dad got divorced. She took me in and we couldn't afford your prices after—" Sighing, Jasmine began again. "Well, anyway, my husband and I bought a house not far from where we used to live, and he says we can build a porch and a house with a jacuzzi. I think we have something to do, too, if the prices are not too high. When I found out you had a construction business, I just had to see if you'd be interested in it before I contacted anyone else." We spent most of the morning talking about old times and what she and her husband, Stephen, had in mind. After we had a rough idea of what she wanted, I told her I would need to view the house and take measurements before I could make an offer. She said, "No problem, Don. We can go somewhere right now, or... I'm not working, so I don't mind if you want to do it any time." "I'll tell you what," I said. "Why don't I come by today around 1 o'clock in the afternoon? I need to check on my workers and get something to eat, and then I have all day to take measurements and make an estimate. Does it suit you?" Jasmine left the office and I followed her. I told Laura, my secretary, "I won't be here until the end of the day. I'm going to check out all the job sites, grab something to eat, and then go see Mrs. Sloane to evaluate her little job. Just close it when you go home. If you need me, call my cell phone." Everything was going well at work, but I stayed a little longer than I should have to visit one of the property owners. This made me late for lunch and got to Sloane's around 1:30. Jasmine met me at the door, and the first thing I did was apologize for being late. "Mrs. Sloane, sorry for being late. I contacted one of the property owners and waited for him. I tried to call you, but I only had an answering machine." Mrs. Sloane giggled and then said, "Dawn, I told you I'm Jasmine." "I'm sorry I didn't hear the call. When I returned home, I was cleaning the pool and forgot to take my radio telephone with me. There's nothing special about it. Now you are here. Do you want something to drink or want to explore the area?" "I'm fine, Jasmine. Let's just go out and look around your backyard." I took all the measurements and said, "Well, it's no problem to estimate everything that I usually use, but since you don't have a hot tub, you really need to buy one before I give you a price. I need to know her dimensions before I can order some of the materials we'll be using." "Oh," Jasmine said, "I thought you would furnish the bath too. I don't know much about them and, well, can't you just include that in the application too?" I laughed and said, "Yes, Jasmine. I think I can do that, but we don't sell them and I'll have to buy it somewhere else. To do this, I need to know what size you want. Will it be grounded or stand alone? Will it work on 210 or 110 volts? Jasmine looked so upset that it relieved my heart. I remembered when she was younger how she could get so upset over little things. Finally, I said, "Well, let's talk about it for a little while and then maybe you could call your husband or talk to him about it tonight. I can just hold off on this until you decide what kind of bath you want." Now Jasmine looked truly worried. She was almost shaking as she said, "Oh no, I can't call him about this. He told me to deal with it and I intend to do so. He's on a business trip in Denver, so I won't see him until this weekend. Maybe we can just sort this out?" I asked Jasmine more about how they would use the bathroom and learned that they rarely had guests. And in fact, she was the one who used the pool and backyard mostly. Sometimes 1 or 2 friends also came to see her. Finally, I had enough information. We went to my supplier and let her look at the tubs. Jasmine decided to buy a smaller bathtub for 5 people. I got the measurements, and we went back to her house. I asked if she had a place where I could connect to the internet to access my office. Some of the items I needed for budgeting changed on Thursdays, and I wanted to have an accurate price list before I started working. Jasmine smiled and said, "Of course, Don. Why don't you come into the office? Steve is a manufacturer representative for Savin Business Systems. He had a really nice office so he could work from home when he wasn't traveling. You can connect your laptop to our network portal or use our computer in any of these options." I walked into the office and stood in amazement. He set it up almost like a regular business office in an office building. His desk was to the left of the door leading into the room. The office windows overlooked the backyard. There were 2 beautiful leather chairs in front of the desk and a bookshelf opposite. I was impressed. Jasmine walked behind the desk and pulled out a chair. She smiled at me and said, "You can sit here while you work. If you need anything, just ask." "Thank you," I said, walking to the table. I put my laptop on the table and sat down. Jasmine handed me a DSL cable to connect to my computer. When I reached for it, I had to reach for the photograph. I looked at the photo and stopped. I pulled my hand back and stared at it, then reached out and picked it up. Jasmine looked at me in confusion as she held out the cord in my direction. She saw my face and the way I was clutching the photograph and asked, "Don, is something wrong?" "This is my husband, my pride and joy. I keep trying to get him to throw away this photo and get another one from his Chevelle, but he won't. I'm really tired of looking at his ex-girlfriend when I use the desk." "Don, do not look at me so. What's the matter?" Jasmine asked again. I carefully replaced the photograph and moved away from the table. I looked at Jasmine and asked, "Did you tell me your husband was in Denver?" She looked surprised and then said, "Yes, I said that." "Why did you ask?" "My wife is in Denver and stayed there all week." "Jasmine, did you ask Steven where to go for an assessment, or did you tell him you were going to talk to me?" "No." "Don, what difference does it make anyway? He simply told me if I needed a deck and a hot tub and to get an estimate. He said if it didn't cost more than $20,000, I could do it. So why are you asking these questions?" "Jasmine, the woman Steve is with in this photo is my wife." Jasmine smiled and said, "Oh, it's so strange that you married Steve's ex-girlfriend. We've only been married 18 months. When did you get married?" I felt my stomach churn and looked back at Jasmine. "Vicky and I have been married for 9 years. This photo was taken no more than 2 years ago because it is of a necklace I bought for Christmas a little over 2 years ago. She bought an outfit that she will wear to go on vacation next summer." Jasmine stood there for a moment, then said, "Don, I feel sorry for you if you say what I think about you, but... Okay, why are you worried that she's in Denver?" "Jasmine, you said you were married for 18 months. Do you know when this photo was taken? From what I remember of what Vicky was wearing in this photo, it may have been taken around the time you got married. When did Steve have time to frame it? Why did he say, but it can't be because the photo was taken the day he won first prize at the big Chevrolet car show in the state? It was..." Jasmine began to cry and fell into one of the comfortable chairs in front of the desk. She continued quietly, "It was 3 weeks before we got married. I just never thought. I mean, he said it was an old photo, but he was holding the first place trophy. Damn him." "Jasmine, wait," Don said. "Let's think about everything carefully. I saw all this while working in a restaurant. I learned to ignore other people's affairs and not talk about them, because traitors are always caught in the end. I admit it looks bad, but all we know right now is that Steve and Vicky are standing in front of his car, hugging each other. We also know that the photo was taken approximately 18 months to 2 years ago. You are quite younger than us. I don't think Steve could be Vicky's old boyfriend because we started dating when we were 18, and both worked at my dad's restaurant. Although he might be. I know the names of everyone she had a crush on when she was younger. No more than you probably know Steve. By the way, how old is he? He, he's 29, and I'm 27. Ha. Well, this is possible because Vicky is not yet 31 years old. I just do not know. Crap. What should we do now? If we ask them about it, all they will do is deny it, regardless of whether they had an affair in the past or not. If they are having an affair and we ask, they may run away or simply become more secretive. I feel like I need to ask, and yet, until today, I would say that I trusted Vicky implicitly. Crap. I just do not know. We talked some more and came up with what we thought was an acceptable plan. We would say nothing about what we thought we discovered that day. Jasmine wouldn't tell Steve about the conversation with me, and we would hire a private investigator to check on Vicky and Steve. The next day, Jasmine and I spoke to the security company we use for our construction sites, and they referred us to the investigative company they use. We spoke with their staff and signed a contract for their services. We each gave them a check for our share of the advance, and went home. Jasmine shortened the name on the check so that if Steve asked, she could say it was a deposit for the job we were talking about, and I was using a business account. Vicky never saw any checkbooks or receipts, so I was safe. I would just have to pay damages to the business. 3 weeks later, Jasmine and I met with the investigator. He said, "Don, Jasmine, I'm sorry. No, this is wrong. I'm happy to report that we can't find anything to indicate that your spouses are dating or even know each other. We watch them every afternoon and after work, and they didn't do anything they weren't supposed to do. The only unusual event was last Friday, when Mrs. Patterson and several of the women she works with went out after work. They went to several bars in St. Louis and danced with several men each. Vicky danced with Steve once, but it was decent. There was space between them, and neither of them allowed their hands to wander. There was no kissing or anything untoward. No one else saw them talking to each other after the dance. I hid and leaned back in my chair. I looked at the investigator, then at Jasmine. I was beginning to believe that this whole mess was the result of my ingrained mistrust acquired while working in the family business. I checked all the phone records. We even installed cameras and voice recorders in the house, as well as voice recorders in Vicky's car and purse. They were also spotlessly clean. Finally, I sighed and said, "Well, I guess we can just chalk it up to paranoia then. You have no idea how happy I am to know this, but I'm so ashamed that I even thought that Vicky and Steve would do something like that. We can just stop this." Wait a minute. Jasmine, didn't you tell me Steve was going to San Antonio next week? Jasmine looked puzzled, then said, "Yes." What does this have to do with... Oh, we won't have to keep an eye on anyone next week, will we? I think this is exactly the moment when we need them to be monitored. Vicky told me 2 weeks ago that she had a compliance check scheduled for next week. I don't remember exactly where she said she was going, but I think it was Austin, Texas. Depending on where in these cities they stop, the distance between them may only be about an hour or maybe less. We've pretty much established that they don't occur here in this area. I think we need to at least check this next trip. If they come out clean after this, I'm willing to admit that I acted like a paranoid fool despite what we saw in this photo. It's reasonable to assume that if they were old friends, Vicky would have allowed him to take a photo of her with him and his trophy. Throughout all the uncertainty and investigation, Jasmine and I could see no signs that Vicky or Steve were treating us any differently. They were exactly the same as they had always been. I thought and thought, but I couldn't figure out how Vicky was different from when we were dating or right after we got married. She treated me as if I was the only man in the world. She came to me for sex and had sex with me when I asked, just like she always did. She was as loving and attentive as at any other time in our lives. The Friday night before Vicky's next trip, we went out for dinner on a date. Later that night, when we were snuggled in bed, I asked, "Vicky, do you remember how we worked at Dad's restaurant and laughed at all the cheaters and people who did inappropriate things?" I thought I felt a slight tension in Vicky's muscles, but I couldn't be sure. She smiled and turned her face to me, then said, "Yes." Some of these people were definitely dumb. Every now and then, when a man or woman at work does something like this, I think back to those days and think how stupid they were. Why did you ask? Oh, one of the men at work thinks his wife is cheating on him, but he hasn't found anything to prove it. When he told me about his fears, I remembered those days and told him to just relax. I told him if she cheats to keep his eyes and ears open, that eventually the cheater will always be found out. I told him that the more time he takes to sort things out, the better it will be for his children, because divorce always hurts children. Vicky looked a little sad as she said, "Why do you assume that a marriage will automatically end in divorce? Maybe the wife really loves her husband and well, maybe the affair doesn't mean anything to her and she doesn't want a divorce." "Oh no, Vicky. He's just like me. He's used to seeing people in bars and has the same low tolerance for cheating as we do. I can't imagine him just agreeing to a long-term fling like you, or I would. I think he might agree to a one-night stand, but as far as a fling goes, no way." Vicky tensed again when I said I wouldn't agree to a long-term relationship, but then she smiled and turned to me. She kissed me tenderly and said, "Well, I'm glad you're still the man I married. We both know about outright affairs and the heartache they can bring. If he really has problems, bring him to his senses, and perhaps you and I can help him recover." Good night, sweetheart.